2:47 in the afternoon, January the 13th, 1955, the North Kent lines are disappearing. Not slowly, not gradually. 1 hour the tracks are visible. The next, they are gone beneath a wall of white, moving in from the Thames estuary at speed. The blizzard that strikes that afternoon is not forecast with any precision. The Meteorological Office has issued warnings. But warnings and reality are two different things, and the reality arriving on the Kent coast that Thursday afternoon is something the electrified railway network is not built to handle. The electric third rail is the problem. It always is. Buried under packed snow and ice, the conductor rail loses contact. The current fails to transfer. The motors in the electric multiple unit sets fall silent. And somewhere between Gravesend and Gillingham, between Sittingbourne and Faversham, carriages full of passengers simply stop. Standard procedure said wait for the snow to pass. Standard procedure said the electric network was the future. The men at Hither Green Depot had other plans, because they had kept the steam locomotives, not out of sentimentality, out of hard-won experience. This is the story of the afternoon British Railways discovered, not for the first time and not for the last, that progress has a weakness, and that the machines it was trying to retire were the only things that could save it. To understand January the 13th, 1955, you have to understand what the North Kent lines were in the middle of the 1950s. They were not a single route, they were a web. Gravesend to London Bridge, Chatham to Victoria, the loops through Strood, Rochester, Faversham, Sittingbourne, hundreds of thousands of commuters moving daily between the Medway towns and the capital. Working-class passengers mostly, dock workers from Gravesend, factory hands from Sittingbourne, office clerks from Chatham pressing into packed carriages every morning and evening without complaint, because this was how it worked, and had always worked. The southern region had been electrifying aggressively since before the Second World War. The third rail system, 750 volts direct current delivered through a conductor rail running beside the track, was cheap to maintain under normal conditions and efficient at moving large numbers of passengers over relatively short distances. By 1955, the southern region operated more electric route miles than any other part of British Railways. The network was a point of pride. But the third rail had a vulnerability that every signalman, every driver, every station master on the North Kent lines understood from personal experience. Snowpacks under it, ice forms on top of it. When the temperature drops fast and the snow arrives wet and heavy, the rail becomes insulated from the pickup shoes on the electric units. The current cannot bridge the gap. The motors stop. The southern region had developed procedures for this. Pilot motors, small locomotive-hauled de-icing trains, ran ahead of service trains to scrape the conductor rail clear. But pilot motors needed to be in the right place at the right time. On the afternoon of January the 13th, 1955, the blizzard did not give them that time. It arrived across too broad a front, too fast, too heavy. The de-icing equipment was overwhelmed before it could be properly deployed. By 3:15 in the afternoon, multiple electric multiple unit sets had failed between stations across the network. The signalling centres were receiving reports from several locations simultaneously. Control at London Bridge faced a decision tree with no good branches. The steam locomotives waiting at Hither Green were not relics. They were policy. This is important. The decision to retain serviceable steam traction on the southern region was not an accident of bureaucracy or budget constraint. It was a deliberate operational choice made by men who had lived through the winter of 1947, who remembered the paralysis that gripped the network when snow fell for weeks, and the electric units sat helpless on iced-over conductor rails, while passengers froze in the carriages. 1947 had been the lesson. The winter of that year, one of the worst in recorded British meteorological history, had immobilised vast sections of the southern region for extended periods. Electric traction failed repeatedly. Steam locomotives, older, heavier, mechanically simpler, kept running. They ran through drifts that buried the conductor rail entirely. They pushed snowplows ahead of themselves through cuttings blocked to a depth of 4 feet. They hauled passenger trains when nothing else could move. The lesson was filed, acted upon, and maintained. By 1955, Hither Green Depot retained a small pool of steam locomotives specifically designated for emergency cover. They were kept in light steam during the winter months. Crews were rostered who knew how to handle them. The infrastructure, the turntables, the coal stacks, the water columns, was kept operational at significant but deliberate expense. The locomotives themselves were mixed. Some were standard Class 4 mixed traffic engines, the new British Railways standard design introduced in the early 1950s, reliable and competent. Others were older Southern Railway types, moguls and tank engines whose origins went back to the 1920s and 30s, but whose mechanical condition was maintained to operational standard. These were not museum pieces, they were working tools held in reserve. The call from control reached Hither Green at 3:22 in the afternoon. The language in the records is formal and compressed, as railway communications always were. Failed electric services, multiple locations, passengers stranded, steam substitution required immediately on the Gravesend and Chatham main lines. Snowplough working also required on the Faversham loop. The shed foreman, whose name in the surviving records appears as W.T. Parsons, had already anticipated the call. He had been watching the weather since 1 o'clock. He had already ordered 2 locomotives prepared beyond their standing maintenance state. By the time the telephone rang, the fires in both engines had been built up for an hour. The boiler pressure was approaching working level. This was not luck. This was the product of experience, of watching the sky the way railwaymen in the 1950s still watched the sky, the way they checked the thermometer on the shed wall against the feel of the air, the way they listened to the wind direction and made judgments that no procedure manual had ever codified, but that every experienced man in the depot carried in his body. Parsons had the first locomotive, a standard Class 4 tender engine, ready to depart by 3:45, 23 minutes after the formal request. The second was coupled to the snowplough attachment and cleared the depot gates at 4 o'clock. The Gravesend line was the first priority, an electric multiple unit set, a 4-car formation carrying an estimated 140 passengers, had failed at Northfleet. The third rail was packed with wet snow for a continuous stretch of nearly half a mile. The pickup shoes on the electric units were making no contact. The train had been stationary for just over 40 minutes. January the 13th in 1955. The sun had already set, or would have set if it had been visible that afternoon through the cloud cover and driving snow. By 4 o'clock it was functionally dark on the Northfleet section. The passengers in the carriages had no heating. The electric heating system, like the traction motors, depended on the same conductor rail now buried under snow. The temperature inside the carriages was falling toward the temperature outside the carriages. The steam locomotive arrived from the Gravesend direction at 4:18. The driver, whose name is not recorded in the surviving documentation, brought the engine in carefully behind the failed electric unit, coupling up in under 6 minutes under conditions that required working by touch as much as by sight. The guard of the stranded train assisted, shunting movements in failing visibility on an open stretch of line in a blizzard, with a steam locomotive whose tender blocked the driver's rearward sight lines, required communication by whistle and lamp signals of a kind that had been standard railway practice for 80 years and remained entirely reliable because it depended on nothing more complex than sound and light. At 4:27 the steam engine began to move. It was dragging 4 carriages of electric multiple unit stock, a formation the locomotive was not designed to haul, eased down a line designed for different traction entirely. The locomotive managed it without difficulty. Standard Class 4s were capable of hauling mixed freight and passenger loads across the mainline network. 4 carriages of electric stock, perhaps 200 tons total with passengers, was well within their operational range. The train reached Gravesend Station at 4:41, 14 minutes. The passengers disembarked onto platforms where station staff had already prepared the waiting rooms, where coal fires had been lit, and tea was available, because this was also policy, because this also reflected the accumulated knowledge of what winter emergencies looked like in practice. On the Chatham main line the situation was more complex. The blizzard had arrived with particular violence in the Medway Valley, and channeled by the topography of the river plain into something approaching a ground blizzard in the cutting sections between Rochester and Chatham. 3 separate electric multiple unit sets were reported failed or significantly delayed on this stretch by 4 o'clock. The conductor rail was not merely iced over. In several sections it was buried under drifted snow to a depth that the de-icing equipment could not clear without the snowplough working ahead. The snowplough locomotive from Hither Green reached the Medway area via a route that required careful routing through the signalling centres, because the snowplough itself, a heavy wooden and steel wedge fitted to the front of the locomotive, made it an unusual and potentially hazardous presence on a busy commuter network where multiple train movements were still being attempted despite the conditions. The snowplough, working on the Faversham Loop and the Chatham Main Line section, was conducted through the early evening of January the 13th, in conditions that the men working them later described, in the limited accounts that survive, as among the worst they had experienced in regular service. Not the worst winter, but the worst rate of deterioration. The blizzard had arrived fast and was piling snow against cuttings faster than the plough could clear them on a single pass. Several sections required 2 and 3 passes before the line was clear enough to guarantee electric rail contact. The West Coast Postal is a different part of the same story, and it arrives, as disrupted trains always do, carrying the weight of everything that happened upstream. The down-working of the West Coast Postal to Aberdeen on the evening of January the 13th, 1955, was over 3 hours late by the time it reached London. The reasons were upstream and complex. Snow accumulation on the main West Coast route north of the capital had delayed the train's earlier workings, and the cumulative delay built through the afternoon and into the evening. The train carried Royal Mail sorting carriages as well as passengers. The post that needed to reach Aberdeen by morning was not going to reach Aberdeen by morning. 3 hours late on the West Coast Postal was not merely an operational inconvenience, it was a contract failure, a log entry in the accounts of British Railways that would be reviewed, documented, and factored into the ongoing argument about weather resilience on the mainline network. The postal contract was money. The delay was an argument for spending more money on snow clearance infrastructure. This is how railway history actually works, in the gap between the dramatic moments and the administrative consequences. The locomotive that pulled carriages of shivering commuters out of a dark cutting near Northfleet in a January blizzard was the visible event. The form filed at the regional headquarters, recording the delay to the West Coast Postal, the cost of the steam substitution, the overtime payments to Hither Green crews, was the document that shaped policy decisions 6 months later. By 8 o'clock in the evening of January the 13th, the North Kent lines were largely operational again. Not fully. There were still sections of the Faversham Loop that the snowplough had not cleared, and electric services on those sections did not resume until the following morning, when the track maintenance crews had worked through the night. But the main Chatham and Gravesend routes were running, late and disrupted, but running, and the passengers who had been stranded in cold carriages that afternoon were home by the time the evening news was broadcast on the wireless. The steam locomotives returned to Hither Green Depot in the early hours of the 14th. The crews who had driven them through the blizzard went home to sleep. The maintenance staff prepared the engines for the next call, which they knew, as everyone knew, would come. Not necessarily this winter, perhaps next winter, perhaps the winter after that, but it would come. The argument that January the 13th illustrated was not a new argument. It was the same argument that had been running through British railway management since electrification began accelerating in the 1930s. The third rail was efficient, modern, and economical under normal conditions. Under abnormal conditions, it was fragile. Steam traction was expensive, dirty, labour-intensive, and required infrastructure, the coal, the water, the turntables, the skilled crews that electricity was supposed to make obsolete. But steam ran through snow. The men making the policy decisions at the southern region in the mid-1950s were not romantics. They were not keeping steam locomotives because they loved the sound of them or the smell of them, though some of them probably did love those things and would not have admitted it. They were keeping steam locomotives because the cost of keeping them was demonstrably lower than the cost of failing to keep them on days like January the 13th, 1955. This calculation would eventually change. By the early 1960s, better de-icing technology and improved conductor rail designs would reduce the frequency and severity of winter failures. The economics would shift. The steam reserve would shrink. The last steam-hauled emergency substitution on the southern region would happen without anyone marking it as the last, because no one knew at the time that it was the last. But in January of 1955, the calculation still favoured the old machines, and the old machines, as they had in 1947 and would again in 1963, delivered. There is a photograph in the collection of the National Railway Museum at York. It shows a standard Class 4 locomotive on the southern region in winter. The date written on the back in pencil is not entirely legible, but it is from the mid-1950s. The locomotive is running light engine on an electrified line. The conductor rail is visible beside the track packed with snow. The locomotive's fire is drawing well. You can see the steam. The electric overhead equipment on a different part of the network where overhead rather than third rail electrification has been installed stands unused and silent behind it. The locomotive is going somewhere. The electric infrastructure is not. That is the whole story, in one frame. The photograph is not dramatic. Nothing is on fire. No one is in distress. The machine is simply working in conditions where the other system cannot work, on a January afternoon in 1955 on the North Kent lines. It worked. That was enough.